There's a killer on the loose, and someone must know who he is. The police and a grieving family need your help. As you're about to see, the nature of the killing leads to the fear that he might well strike again.
Hello and welcome to Psycho Killer. I'm Simon Ford, a writer and journalist.
And I'm Jacques Morrell. I always wanted to be a writer and journalist, but I was drawn towards crime. Well, fighting it at least. I was a police homicide detective for many years.
And I'm Pip Watts. I'm a broadcaster, journalist, and at one stage I worked with Simon. He made me an offer I couldn't refuse, and now I'm part of the Psycho Killer crew. This is the second episode in our mini-series about familial DNA and killers who were caught because of deposits from their crime scenes linking them to other family members. They thought they'd gotten away with it, but they hadn't.
In episode 1, we looked into the black heart of Joseph James D'Angelo Jr., the Golden State Killer. He slew 13 victims and raped countless others in California in the 1970s and 80s. He was caught 30 years after his last murder when the police cross-matched DNA from his crime scenes with the genetic fingerprints of innocent relatives on ancestry research sites.
Our second study is a cold case that I worked on when it reopened in 2008. 25 years prior, a teenage girl had been found stripped naked, raped and murdered in a field in rural Nottinghamshire. Her murderer was no Robin Hood. He was a deranged sex killer. The girl's name was Colette-aram.
Colette-aram was a 16-year-old trainee hairdresser from Keyworth, a village nestled in the rolling countryside of the South Nottinghamshire Wolds. At 8 p.m. on Sunday the 30th of October 1983, Colette left home to walk to her boyfriend's house, a trip of about 20 minutes. He usually picked her up, but his car was being repaired. Colette was last seen at about 8:10 by a small group of friends she stopped to talk to. Witnesses later reported hearing a woman scream and a car driving off at speed. Colette never arrived at her boyfriend's house. After 2 hours of ringing round her friends, her parents made a frantic phone call to the police. At 9 o'clock the following morning, Colette's naked body was found in a farmer's field, about 1.5 miles from where she'd been abducted. She had been raped and strangled. The murder of Colette-aram was the first case to be featured on the BBC television series Crimewatch-uk, which reconstructed unsolved crimes to gain information from members of the public.
Superintendent Bob Davey heads the inquiry team. Today, 7 months and 2,000 statements later, they still haven't found the killer. And without your help, it's like looking for a needle in a haystack. A man who's white, aged roughly 25 to 35, with probably brown, wavy hair.
So what the hell do we know about him? He's not going to sit in his house with the word murderer written across his chest or across his back, is he? He's got some sort of sexual hang-up. He likes young kids. It's not going to be ever so obvious when you go through the door. But talk to the people, talk to the wives. Let's find him, because he's about somewhere. Colette's left in a field, don't forget that. We're dealing with a savage killing. Let's sniff him out and let's see if we can find him.
I was in a small team tasked with re-investigating Colette's killing 25 years after her rape and murder. Like the Golden State Killer, I felt like we had one last chance to crack the case. Our predecessors had exhausted every line of inquiry, or so it seemed.
And if I remember correctly, the press were reminding you of that at every opportunity, eh?
Indeed, they were. Now, Colette's murder had not only devastated her family, it had a knock-on effect in the wider community too. People looked at their neighbours suspiciously. Could one of them be the killer? Or was he a stranger, somebody passing through, preying on random lone women? Either way, the killer was still out there. He had to be caught. That was our job.
Colette's killer must have thought he'd got away with it. I suppose people don't simply disappear, do they? Where did you think he was? Where was he hiding out?
Well, for me, the two main possibilities were that he was either dead or he'd emigrated. but I just couldn't fathom how someone could have committed this awful crime and then not come to our notice again. So, we brought in the forensic team to have a look at the DNA. This science was in its infancy in 1983, but the evidence from the scene had been preserved. The question was, could we get enough DNA from the 25-year-old samples?
Finally, those samples came back from the lab. The DNA was intact. The killer had worn gloves, but his genetic fingerprints were all over Colette's clothing. The fact of the matter was, though, you still needed to match his DNA profile to a suspect, and you didn't have a suspect.
Well, yes. The 1983 investigation left us one tenuous lead. On the night of Colette's murder, a man was seen literally with blood on his hands.
He said. Ham?
Yes, please, yeah.
The manager of the Generous-Briton-Pub, a few miles down the road from Keyworth, recalled a curious incident. Around 9 o'clock, a customer walked through the door. He wasn't one of the regulars. When he ordered a pint of orange and lemonade and a ham sandwich, the manager noticed what looked like blood on his hands. The man asked the way to the lavatory where he washed his hands. He sat quietly by himself and left as soon as he'd finished. The next morning, the manager heard about the body of a young woman being discovered nearby. She put two and two together and called the police about the stranger with blood on his hands. Detectives visited the Generous-Briton-Pub, checked the lavatory and recovered the used paper towels from the wastebasket.
So, you've got a murder up the road and a suspicious character, a stranger, washing blood off his hands in a pub just a few miles away. Did the police join the dots at the time?
Well, they certainly put him down as a person of interest, but he wasn't nailed on for Colette's murder. Luckily for us, though, the paper towel was preserved as evidence. We retrieved it from the forensic store and sent it off. Scientists did more tests. Forensics found a mix of two people's DNA, Colette's blood and the killer's semen. A brilliant result, but there was still no match, so we had to pin our hopes on elimination. We appealed for members of the public to come forward with the names of suspects who could then be asked for their DNA, subject to checks. Not only that, we were travelling the length and breadth of the country, tracing people named in the original investigation, inviting them to provide their DNA in order to eliminate themselves. Men who weren't suspects, but whose names had been suggested for any number of reasons. There were thousands to get through. We had a way of prioritising them, but it was still like looking for a needle in a haystack.
Did many refuse?
Remarkably, very few.
And they would have been put in the difficult box for later, I suppose, yeah?
Yeah. And as we were trawling through these names, the senior investigating officer, Superintendent Flint, was speaking to the scientists. He'd already asked them to check the whole of the database several times. Even so, it was possible that the killer was an only child, his parents would certainly be elderly or possibly dead, and whether he had no children.
The SIO must have thought the only way was to continue tracing those thousands of named individuals all over the country. Almost resigned, I suppose, to the long game.
Right. And in early 2009, Superintendent Flint asked the scientists to run one more check of the database.
Remarkably, in June of that year, a 20-year-old man, Paul Hutchinson, had been arrested for a traffic offence. His DNA was taken and had been uploaded to the database. The scientists must have stopped in their tracks when it appeared on the screen. Jean-Paul's father was almost certainly the killer.
Fortunately for us, not only was his father named on the birth register, he was still alive and still living in the same area, just down the road from where Colette was murdered.
Paul Stewart Hutchinson, father of Jean-Paul and then aged 50, was arrested and charged with the murder in April 2009. Originally, Hutchinson tried to blame one of his brothers. In an attempt to shift the blame, he chose the one brother who couldn't speak up for himself. Why? Because brother Gerhard was dead and his body had been cremated. The detectives had seen that one coming and had already ruled out that brother. Gerhard's DNA was obtained from a blood sample taken in the course of his hospital treatment. Paul Hutchinson, the family man who kept his head down for 25 years, was remanded in custody. He initially entered a plea of not guilty on the 5th of October, but then at a pre-trial hearing on the 21st of December 2009, there was a dramatic moment when he instructed his defence team to change his plea. Guilty. He simply had nowhere to go and no one else to blame. Here's what the Mirror Online reported when Paul Hutchinson was sentenced in January 2010. A brute who raped and killed a teenager 26 years ago was jailed yesterday, trapped by his son's DNA. Twisted Paul Hutchinson, 50, was caught when his son gave a sample after being arrested for a car offence. Passing sentence, Mr. Justice Flo said the attack was, quote, violent, twisted and perverted, and subjected Colette to unimaginable terror and degradation, unquote. He added it was a terrible act which tore Colette's family apart and left a community haunted. The killing was clearly premeditated. You concealed your guilt for more than 25 years, he told Hutchinson, and only pleaded guilty when the evidence became overwhelming. Hutchinson showed no signs of emotion and gazed at the packed gallery where Colette's family sat.
Her mother, Jacques, was comforted by Colette's father, Tony Aram, and brother Mark. Outside Nottingham Crown Court, Jacques said, "We have spent 26 years wondering who murdered Colette. You could see Hutchinson has no remorse. There are still a lot of questions only he can answer."
The court heard Hutchinson spent the days before and after the killing away from home, and he told his family he'd had a lung removed because of cancer. Gregory Dickinson QC told how the, quote, innocent, sexually inexperienced girl was conscious during the assault. He said her murder was, quote, premeditated and sexually motivated, unquote.
Hutchinson tied Colette's hands with her bra and blouse and dumped the rest of her clothes in a ditch. He left her body in an overtly sexual pose. An hour later, he walked into the Generous Briton in nearby Costock and ate a sandwich while chatting to the landlady. The only time Hutchinson spoke of the killing was in a patrol car en route to the station, saying, "I'll tell you everything I can, but I can't remember much. It's like a dream."
The judge ruled that Hutchinson would serve at least 25 years before being considered eligible for parole. The likelihood was that he'd die behind bars, and so he did, though not from old age. Colette-Aram's killer took his own life after spending a little over a year in prison. He never explained why he did what he did. Another interesting facet during the early months of the case was a letter claiming to be from the killer that was sent to a local newspaper office a matter of weeks after Colette's murder. The letter was written in an unusual style. All the capital S's were replaced with exclamation marks. The writer claimed he'd been hiding in a hut watching girls riding horses when he spotted a car with the keys left in it. The writer goaded the police, saying, "Masks are common around Halloween. No one knows what I look like. That's why you've not got me." The letter continued, "I go soon, and then you will never get me."
Police called in language experts to help identify the killer's accent, his turn of phrase, a hypnotist to help a key witness recall vital facts, and even in 1984, a clairvoyant to talk to Colette's mother. One expert concluded the letter contained nothing that wasn't in the public domain and was probably a hoax. What do you make of that, Jack?
Well, yes, it had been reported in the press that the killer had almost certainly stolen a car from some stables earlier in the day, and the car had been seen driving around several villages in the area.
So the car was recovered but didn't help to identify the killer. The letter claiming to be from him and boasting that you'll never get me, that was icing on the cake in terms of the investigation.
Yes, and when Hutchinson was linked to the letter by his fingerprint, it really summed up how callous and evil he was.
Can someone that evil just change? It's hard to imagine.
Apart from the letter that goaded the police, where he gloated that he wouldn't be caught, did Paul Hutchinson display sociopathic traits? Despite the sexual nature of his crime, there's no evidence of promiscuous sexual behaviour. He was married and remained so until his arrest. One-night stands weren't in his nature. There's no record of early behavioural problems or juvenile delinquency. He had no criminal background. And there's no evidence he lacked realistic long-term goals. On the other hand, we have clear evidence of pathological lying, manipulation, and a lack of remorse and guilt. He was a pathological liar and callously taunted the police with that letter. So, having weighed the information available, Paul Hutchinson was not a psychopath. He was a nondescript young man who inexplicably committed a heinous crime to satisfy his own sexual urges. Having got away with it for 25 years, he chose to keep the reasons why to himself, offering no apology or explanation. Taking his own life was all about him and his lack of remorse.
So, what do we know about Paul Hutchinson? Well, unlike D'Angelo, the Golden State Killer, very little was recorded or written about him. Local man, married once, raised a family, did a bit of community work, self-employed newspaper distributor. That seems to be about the size of it.
Yes, very much so. Raised in the area and from a settled home background. Nothing remarkable about him.
And he never made any confession about what he did and why?
That's right. I guess whatever his state of mind and motivation at the time, he'd erased it and lived with the lie for so long.
So at the time of the murder, he was, in his early 20s?
Yeah, he was in a relationship with the woman who would go on to be his wife and have 4 children with. At the time of the murder, they were living with his wife's parents, although he'd spent a few days away at the time of the murder and had convinced people that he'd been in hospital.
So maybe he found it difficult living with his in-laws, a pressure cooker environment where the physical side of that relationship wasn't able to blossom.
I think that's exactly it. So he went off for a few days. His sexual interest in girls on horses was evident. His sexual urges overwhelmed him, and he went on to commit the most despicable of crimes.
And then he never offended again.
It appears so. Incredible, isn't it? D'Angelo was out of control, but Hutchinson seemed to move on.
Thanks for listening. In the next instalment of our mini-series, the Psycho Killer team goes down under for another shocking true crime story solved by familial DNA.
Or as I'm calling it, you can choose your friends, but not your relations.
Until the next time, it's goodbye from me, from Pip, and from Jack. We'll see you again very soon on the dark side for another Psycho Killer shocking true crime adventure.